Tonight, you're about to see Jasmine Crockett face an insult no one should ever hear on live television, and then turn it into the most powerful comeback of her career. The cameras flickered on, the lights glowed bright. A polished studio set the stage for what at first glance looked like a simple live discussion. The topic of the evening was framed in neutral terms: political controversy and the growing question of family influence inside the White House. Nothing too unusual. Nothing the audience hadn't heard before. The host seated at the center of the table introduced the guests one by one. On his right was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Her reputation preceded her. She was known as someone who never backed down, someone whose voice carried both fire and clarity. Tonight she looked ready, a calm smile, shoulders straight, eyes sharp. Everything about her posture said, "I am prepared." On the opposite side sat Barron Trump, tall, composed, carrying the unmistakable presence of his last name. Though younger than most in the room, Barron radiated a quiet confidence, almost as if simply being a Trump gave him a shield of authority. His calm expression suggested he was ready to play the role of the provocateur, the one who stirs the pot when others try to keep it steady. The audience at home saw two figures sitting across from each other, each representing more than themselves. Jasmine, the sharp congresswoman, unafraid of confrontation; Barron, the heir of a political dynasty; his father, currently the president. Both carried weight, but in very different ways. At first, the conversation flowed smoothly. The host directed questions about policy, about how much influence family members should have in the day-to-day workings of government. Jasmine spoke with measured confidence, explaining that transparency was the key to trust. She used her words carefully, building her argument like a bricklayer stacking stones. Barron responded in a different tone. He was lighter, almost casual, as if the conversation were just another chat at the dinner table. He cracked a few smiles, tossed in remarks with a touch of sarcasm, and even complimented Jasmine on her energy. The audience chuckled, easing into the rhythm. For a brief moment, it almost felt like both sides had found a balance, a mutual respect, even if temporary. The host nodded along, seemingly relieved that the discussion was moving forward without fireworks. But beneath the calm surface, something else was brewing. You could see it in the way Barron leaned forward just slightly. Every time Jasmine spoke, you could see it in the way Jasmine's eyes narrowed. Noticing the undertone in his remarks, the cameras captured small details: Jasmine's hand resting firm on the table, Barron's slight smirk when the host asked about White House influence. They were subtle signals, but they carried a message. This calm wouldn't last. The studio itself seemed to sense it. The audience sat a little straighter in their seats. The atmosphere shifted, almost invisible, but undeniable, like the stillness before a storm. The host, unaware of what was coming, pushed on with another question about political qualifications. He turned first to Jasmine, who gave a steady, thoughtful answer. Then he turned to Barron, and that's when the energy changed. Barron's smile lingered for a second too long. His eyes sharpened. He leaned into the microphone, his voice taking on a colder edge. The tension in the room was now thick enough to feel. Everyone watching could sense it. The balance was breaking. What began as a calm discussion was about to twist into something far more dramatic, something that would leave the audience stunned, the host speechless, and Jasmine Crockett standing at the center of a moment no one would forget, and it would all start with one shocking insult. The question seemed harmless enough. The host leaned forward, adjusting his papers, and asked Barron to share his thoughts on what it takes to be a qualified leader in today's political climate. Barron paused. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. For a moment, it looked as though he was deciding whether to give the polished response or to let his true thoughts spill out. The silence stretched. The studio grew still. Then, with a steady biting tone, Barron spoke. He didn't critique policy. He didn't debate ideas. He went straight for Jasmine. "Honestly," he said, his voice smooth but sharp, "I don't even think you're qualified to sit here. Compared to me, your track record is weak. You sound emotional, not logical. If I'm being real, you need less time in politics, and maybe more time in a mental hospital." The words hit like a thunderclap. For a split second, no one moved. You could hear the collective intake of breath from the studio audience. The host's jaw tightened, his eyes darting nervously between Barron and Jasmine, as if searching for a way to pull the conversation back to safe ground. But it was too late. The insult had landed. It wasn't just a casual jab. It was calculated, personal, and cruel. A direct strike meant not only to belittle Jasmine's intelligence, but to wound her dignity in front of a live audience. Jasmine sat still, her face unreadable at first, but behind her steady expression, there was fire. You could see it flicker in her eyes, that mix of hurt and fury that comes when someone crosses a line you never thought they'd dare cross. The audience shifted in their seats. Some gasped, others whispered, while the cameras zoomed closer, capturing every ounce of tension. This was no longer a polite panel. This was a battlefield. And Barron had just thrown the first grenade. Barron leaned back in his chair, almost satisfied. His smirk widened as though he had delivered a clever blow. He expected Jasmine to shrink, to stutter, maybe even to lose her composure. That was the trap. He wanted control of the stage. He wanted to silence her by pushing her into an emotional corner. But silence never lasts long in moments like this. The host tried to cut in, clearing his throat. "Let's keep this civil," he began. But the sentence dissolved under the weight of what had just happened. Civil. The air was already electric, charged with confrontation. And Jasmine knew it. She slowly leaned forward, her hand pressing firmly on the table. She didn't rush her reply. She let the pause grow, let the audience feel the suspense stretch tighter and tighter. The room was hanging on her next words, waiting to see if she would break or if she would fight. Her lips curved into a controlled smile, not of amusement, but of defiance. She locked eyes with Barron. What came next would not just be a rebuttal. It would be a question so bold, so unexpected that it would flip the entire stage upside down. The insult had been cruel, but Jasmine was about to strike back with something far more devastating, something that cut deeper than any accusation of weakness or instability. Single question, one that would force Barron Trump to confront the most guarded and controversial shadows of his own family. And when it left her lips, the entire nation would be talking about it. For a moment, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. She sat still, her hand firm on the table, her eyes locked on Barron like a laser. The room was heavy with silence. But it wasn't the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a storm gathering strength. The quiet before lightning splits the sky. Barron smirked again, as if convinced that his insult had struck her down. He leaned back, confident, waiting for her to stumble. But Jasmine wasn't stumbling. She was calculating. The audience could see it. The way her shoulders stayed steady. The way her jaw tightened. The way her expression shifted from shock to controlled defiance. She wasn't going to let his words define her. No, she was about to redefine the entire conversation. Slowly, she leaned toward her microphone. Her voice, when it came, was calm, but sharp. Each word deliberate, like the crack of a whip. "You think you can question my qualifications, Barron? You think you can insult my intelligence and hide behind your last name?" Barron's smirk wavered just slightly. Jasmine's tone grew stronger, her voice carrying across the studio. "You came here to make me look small. But here's something the American people really want to know. And maybe you should answer it." She paused. The silence stretched thick with anticipation. The audience leaned forward. The host froze, and even the cameras seemed to draw closer, sensing what was about to happen. Then Jasmine delivered it. The question that would slice through Barron's smirk cut through the walls of the studio, and echo far beyond that stage. "Tell us, Barron, who's your mom? Ivanka or Melania?" Gasps erupted from the audience. The host's eyes went wide, his hand halfway raised as if to stop her. But it was too late. The words were out, heavy and undeniable. The impact was immediate. Barron's confidence cracked. His smirk faltered into a stiff expression, his posture shifting uneasily in his chair. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't prepared for this. The question wasn't just about family. It was about power. It was about influence. And it was about pulling the curtain back on the shadows of the Trump household. The whispers of Ivanka's oversized role, Melania's quieter presence, and the blurred lines between personal loyalty and political authority. Jasmine had taken his cruel insult and flipped it into a moment of searing exposure. She wasn't attacking his intelligence or his mental health. She was challenging the very foundation of his identity on national television. The audience couldn't look away. Some sat frozen in disbelief. Others murmured to each other, shocked that anyone would dare speak those words out loud. And Barron, he tried to respond. He opened his mouth, but no clear words came at first. He stammered, searching for a way to deflect, to redirect, to push the spotlight off himself and back onto Jasmine. But in that moment, the damage was done. The balance of power on stage had shifted. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving Barron's face. She didn't need to say more. Her question hung in the air like a blade suspended above the table, daring him to grab it, daring him to answer. The host finally broke the silence, his voice shaky as he tried to steer the conversation elsewhere. But everyone knew the discussion had changed forever. Barron had fired the first shot with his insult, but Jasmine had answered with a strike so devastating, so personal that it turned the entire stage upside down. It wasn't just a comeback. It was a revelation, and Barron Trump had no idea how to escape it. The air in the studio was thick. Jasmine's question, "Who's your mom? Ivanka or Melania?" still lingered like thunder after a lightning strike. The audience sat stunned, waiting for Barron to respond. His eyes darted toward the host, then back at Jasmine. His composure, so polished just moments ago, had begun to crack. For the first time that night, he looked unsettled. Barron leaned into his microphone, his voice strained, but forceful. "That question is ridiculous," he said, trying to sound confident. "You're just trying to distract people, because you have no real arguments. You're obsessed with my family. Maybe you should worry about your own mental health, instead of throwing out crazy accusations." It was a familiar tactic. Redirect, deflect, attack. He was trying to twist the narrative back onto Jasmine, hoping to paint her as unhinged, hoping the audience would forget the sting of her question. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, a calm but knowing smile forming on her lip. She let him finish, gave him all the rope he needed. And then when he stopped, she leaned in once more. "Barron," she said steadily, her voice carrying a weight that silenced the whispers in the room. "This isn't about me. This is about transparency. About the American people knowing who really holds power inside the White House." The host looked tense, torn between cutting in and letting the exchange play out. The cameras zoomed tighter, catching every expression. Barron's unease, Jasmine's control. The audience frozen on the edge of their seats. Jasmine continued, her words precise, every syllable aimed like an arrow. "Everyone can see it. Melania has been quiet, almost invisible in the role of First Lady. But Ivanka has stepped into meetings, advised on policies, sat beside your father in places where no one expected her to be. The question isn't just a personal one. It's political. Who is shaping decisions? Who carries the influence? The people deserve to know." Barron shifted in his chair. He opened his mouth as if to interject. But Jasmine pressed forward. "You try to insult me, to question my intelligence, to tell me I don't belong. But let's be honest. This is bigger than you or me. This is about power. This is about a daughter who has been given the seat of an advisor, while the actual First Lady remains on the sidelines." Gasps rippled through the audience again. The tension had grown sharper, heavier. Jasmine wasn't backing down. She was building a case right there on live television. Barron raised his hand, his tone sharper now. "That's nonsense. You're twisting everything just to attack my family. This isn't transparency. It's just slander. You're making a fool of yourself." But even as he spoke, his voice cracked with frustration. His earlier confidence was gone, replaced by defensiveness. The smirk had vanished. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Call it whatever you want," she replied firmly. "But the American people see the difference. They see the unusual weight Ivanka carries compared to Melania, and they have every right to ask why. I'm not here to slander you, Barron. I'm here to demand clarity for every citizen watching." The host shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the program had gone far beyond its planned script. But the audience wasn't restless. They were riveted. Jasmine had turned what started as a cruel personal attack into something much larger. Barron had tried to dodge, to manipulate, to silence her with insult. But his evasions only highlighted the very point she was making. that there were questions about power inside the Trump family that had never been answered. The balance of power on that stage had shifted entirely. Jasmine was no longer just defending herself. She was holding the floor, holding the truth, and holding Barron accountable in front of the entire nation. And the weight of her words was undeniable. The studio was still buzzing from the clash. Barron sat rigid in his chair, clearly shaken by Jasmine's sharp questions and unrelenting composure. The host shuffled his notes nervously, unsure how to steer the broadcast back to neutral ground. But Jasmine, she wasn't finished. She had the floor now, and she intended to use it. She leaned forward, her eyes steady, her tone calm, yet filled with conviction. This was no longer a simple back and forth. It was a message for everyone watching, not just those in the studio, but millions of Americans sitting at home, eyes glued to their screens. You know, she began slowly, her voice carrying the kind of weight that draws silence. Tonight was never just about me or about Barron. It's about something much bigger. It's about who really shapes the decisions in our country. Decisions that touch every single American life. The audience grew quiet again, this time not from shock, but from focus. They were listening, hanging on each word. Barron tried to throw an insult my way. She continued, her tone unwavering. He wanted to make me seem unfit, unstable, undeserving. But let's be clear. This conversation isn't about whether Jasmine Crockett belongs at the table. It's about why the American people don't know who truly sits at the head of it. She paused, letting the words sink in. Her gaze shifted briefly toward Barron, then back to the camera. Transparency, she said firmly. That's the word, that's the issue. Transparency in who holds power. Transparency in how decisions are made. Because without that, democracy becomes a performance instead of a reality. Barron shifted uncomfortably, crossing his arms, but Jasmine pressed on. Her voice gained strength like a wave-building force as it reached the shore. We've all seen it. The blurred lines, the unusual influence Ivanka Trump has carried compared to Melania. The way power doesn't always follow official titles, but slips behind closed doors into the hands of those with private access. That's what this is really about. Not rumors, not gossip, but power and the right of the people to know who wields it. A murmur rippled through the audience. Not gasps this time, but a low hum of agreement. Heads nodded, faces hardened with thought. Jasmine leaned in closer, almost speaking directly into the living rooms of every viewer. This isn't about parties. This isn't about labels. It's about trust. If Americans can't trust the clarity of their own leadership, how can they trust the decisions being made on their behalf? That's why I asked the question. That's why I pushed back tonight. Because someone has to. Because silence only feeds secrecy. She straightened her shoulders, her expression both firm and resolute. So let me say this clearly. The American people deserve the truth. They deserve honesty about who is shaping their future. And if asking tough questions makes people uncomfortable, then so be it. I will never apologize for demanding accountability. Not from Barron Trump. Not from his father. Not from anyone in power. The words rang through the studio like a bell. Strong, final, unshakable. The host sat speechless, unsure how to wrap up the broadcast after such a statement. Barron stared ahead, his earlier bravado now replaced with silence. In the audience they erupted. Not in laughter, not in whispers, but in a wave of applause that shook the room. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply sat back, calm and composed, her eyes still locked on the camera. Her final words echoed, lingering long after the clapping died down. This isn't about politics. This is about America. And Americans deserve to know who truly holds the pen that writes their future. The cameras froze on her face, capturing the power of that moment.